Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are going to get started in just 1 minute. I see some people still coming in from the waiting rooms. Perfect. Okay. My name is Sophie, and I'm so happy to be welcoming you all here to be with us tonight for a very special program, Feel the History at Your Feet, Nostalgia and American Jewish Religion. Now, I know many of you are joining us from all over, Rachel included, our wonderful speaker today, who's tuning in from San Francisco. But if you've never visited us at Eldridge before, I invite you to please come. We are open now to the public from Sunday through Fridays, 10 to 5 p.m. And we are offering public tours and private tours, in addition to all different kinds of programs, exhibitions, and other kinds of special events. In fact, I'm going to give a special shout out to 2 events that are coming up. On May 12th, we have a new exhibition opening for a show called Steve Marcus, Top Dog of Kosher Pop Art. So that's going to be really fun, all about the hot dog. And then on June 26th, we are hosting our annual Egg Rolls, Egg Creams, and Empanadas Festival. So it'll be our 21st, and we are very, very excited. And I hope that you'll be able to come and join us for this festival. So just some housekeeping before we get started. Your microphones are muted right now, and you will be able to unmute yourself during Q&A when you'd like to ask questions. And to ask a question, you can just type them into the chat box. You can raise your hand and we'll call on you. And we are offering closed captioning tonight, so you can turn that feature on and off by clicking the CC button at the bottom or top of your Zoom screen. Just to let you all know, it is powered by AI, so please excuse any inevitable typos that might occur. And I want to thank you all again for joining us this evening with the museum at Eldridge Street. Now, a little bit about Rachel. She is the assistant professor and John and Marsha Goldman Chair in American Jewish Studies in the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. She is a religious studies scholar who studies 20th and 21st century American Jews, and her book, Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, is a 2021 National Jewish Book Award finalist in American Jewish Studies. And it also received an honorable mention for the 2021 Saul of Meter Book Prize, given by the American Jewish Historical Society. She is currently working on a religious biography of the 20th century immigration writer, Mary Antin. Now, Rachel, please, if you can unmute yourself and welcome.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Thanks to everyone for joining us today and anybody who might join on the recording. Thank you to Sophie for inviting me and planning this talk. I did, as you'll hear about, I did research at the museum at Eldridge Street in the early 2010s when I was working on my PhD dissertation, which turned into this book. And I really am aware that I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the museum's staff members, docents, volunteers, and visitors. Executive Director Bonnie Diamond, who I know I see is here. Thank you so much for letting me do this research, and to everybody who really gave me their time, spoke with me extensively or briefly, and let me hang out and bother them and observe them at their work and on visits. I'm deeply appreciative. And right away, you'll see that the museum influenced my thinking, and the synagogue's gorgeous Kiki Smith window is, of course, featured on the cover of my book. The image of a family is inspired by photos of construction workers standing in front of the window. I am a religious studies professor, which means for me, asking questions about how people make meaning in their lives. Like other religious studies professors, I think of one of the goals of religious studies as making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. So my work is usually on the first half of that phrase. I work on making the familiar strange. So a lot of my work is on analyzing everyday activities that we might take for granted, such as experiences at museums. I think about the ways that we tell stories about ourselves, our families, and our communities through everyday activities, and the ways that we ask weighty existential questions like, who am I and where do I come from? I think these are really ordinary everyday questions, but they're still remarkable ones. And I want to say that in thinking and analyzing and thinking with you about these ordinary activities, I think that not everybody will always agree with my analysis. And what I hope is that this talk and my book, if you choose to look at it, offer one way of looking at the museum at Eldridge Street and its context, one kind of analytical frame for some people's experiences there. And I really hope that even if you don't agree with me, that you'll know that I'm guided by an enormous respect for the work done there and the experiences that people have at the museum at Eldridge Street and the other places that I'm looking at. So with that said, I want to begin with one of my favorite ordinary moments from my research, a moment that you will be familiar with if you've ever gone on one of these wonderful tours at the museum at Eldridge Street. As I observed the tours of the synagogue building, I watched visitors to the museum sit down in the pews of this beautifully restored 1887 Eldridge Street Synagogue on the Lower East Side. And over again, visitors listened to a docent or a staff member recount the history of the Grand Synagogue built by Eastern European Jewish immigrants. When the docent finishes, she often, but not always, she leads the group out of the sanctuary, and the docent pauses at the back of the room. Step into the indentations in the floorboard, she says, and soon people have arranged themselves into straight lines. Pointing to a pattern of indentations, she asks, "Why do you think these are here?" And slowly, the group realizes that they're standing in the footprints of former male congregants. The indentations have been made by men chuckling, rocking back and forth in front of their pew as they prayed in the traditional Jewish fashion. Over the years, they had left their mark in the soft pine floorboards. Sometimes the docent demonstrates the movement, and sometimes others copy her. Some of the visitors shuffle awkwardly, if enthusiastically. Standing in the footprints of former congregants provides an immediate sensory connection to the past. It's something that engages visitors' whole bodies, and the experience is a highlight for many tourists. Somebody wrote on Yelp, "You literally feel the history at your feet." The docent or staff members' careful orchestration of this moment helps visitors to experience a connection to past congregants physically and emotionally. In my book, Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, I look at the materials and institutions through which American Jews engage, promote, teach nostalgia for turn-of-the-century Jewish immigration from Central and Eastern Europe to the United States. And what I've found is that nostalgia, a sentimental longing for Jewish communal origins that can't be fulfilled, is both an emotion and a practice. And as a feeling and as a practice, nostalgia has become, I think, a prominent part of American Jewish religion since the 1970s and into the present day. And in my book, I look at 4 case studies of nostalgia, of American Jewish nostalgia as religion. I look at Jewish genealogists, their materials and the institutions they've created, historic synagogues that are used as museums. I look at children's books and dolls, as well as institutions that promote them, like PJ Library. And finally, I look at artisanal delis and other new Jewish food sites. And what I've found is that some of these items and places and the institutions that create and promote and distribute them encourage American Jews to feel nostalgia for a very particular story about Ashkenazi history, about the history of Jews whose ancestors come from Central and Eastern Europe. And that, again, that nostalgia is best understood as part of American Jewish religion. Now, this is going to require us to expand our understanding of what counts as religious practice and where we look for religious activities. So what I'm going to do in the rest of our time together is think about what kind of nostalgia I'm talking about, what we mean by nostalgia, and what I mean by religion. I'm going to kind of briefly trace the historical development of American Jewish nostalgia, the forms it takes, the places where I see it, and I'll wrap up by thinking about some of the implications for taking this kind of nostalgia seriously. I think that it shows us, against the arguments of some worried scholars and Jewish community leaders, that American Judaism is not in decline, but is evolving and flourishing. I'm going to really place in this talk, I'm going to place the museum at Eldridge Street in the context in which I see it. And I'd love to talk really more specifically in the Q&A about any questions you might have about my research at the museum at Eldridge Street or ways that you have seen your experiences there. So I think that I'm interested in these places and items and institutions, including genealogical societies, museums, publishing companies, organizations like PJ Library, which distributes free books to Jewish and interfaith families, delis, and other food sites. And I'm interested in how these institutions convey or teach nostalgic longing for particular Jewish past as a powerful way of being Jewish. I think it's so powerful in people's lives that I think it's best described as religion. So I think that religion is best understood as meaningful relationships and the practices, narratives, and emotions that create and support these relationships. So we might think of religion as relationships among the living, between the living and the dead, or between humans and the divine. And we emphasize those relationships in different ways and at different times. One of my teachers, the religious studies scholar Catherine Lofton, says religion is a way of describing the structures by which we are bound or connected to one another. And if we think about people's relationships with their families, their communities, their ancestors, and the divine, if we think about all those relationships as central to religion, it lets us see how individuals who might not think of themselves as religious actually make meaning in their lives, as well as how those who do think of themselves as religious find meaning outside of traditional practices, guided by supposedly secular institutions and materials like the museum at Eldridge Street. I think I'm guided by three reasons for thinking broadly about religion. Like, why am I doing this? Why am I redefining religion? First of all, defining religion has actually very serious legal implications in the United States. Organizations that are denoted as religious don't pay taxes, and we accord other privileges to religious groups and spaces. Native Americans, for instance, have repeatedly made the case, often unsuccessfully, that their practices and spaces count as religious in a legal sense because that carries such legal weight. I'm not saying that everything that I'm calling religious here is necessarily going to be legally recognized as religious, but we should recognize that this has enormous consequences in our society. Number two, in the Jewish community, a lot of decisions about large-scale philanthropy are made in ways that are related to what counts as religion. A lot of major philanthropists have been persuaded to give money to Jewish organizations that are ultimately designed to make Jews, especially younger Jews, either more traditionally religious or more tied to the recognizable institutions of American Jewish religion. If we push them on what counts as religion, it might have consequences about where Jewish community money goes. Third, and I think most importantly for me, I think that thinking broadly about religion offers a new and maybe a better way for analyzing how we and how other people around us make meaning in our lives and how we place ourselves inside stories that we think are important. So again, I think religion is meaningful relationships and the practices, narratives, and emotions that create and support these relationships. And I think that American Jews' nostalgia for Eastern European immigration history works in this way. So, of course, the tourists at the museum at Eldridge Street did not just happen to arrive at the historic synagogue and place their feet in the grooves of long ago congregants. As some of you will know, American Jews have long seen the Lower East Side as an authentic, emotional connection to community history. Jewish history in the Americas dates back to the earliest years of European colonialism, but the majority of American Jews today are descended from Central and Eastern Europeans who immigrated to the United States between the 1880s and 1924. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them settled in New York's Lower East Side and other urban immigrant neighborhoods. In the early to mid 20th century, they began to move their families out of these crowded neighborhoods for more spacious parts of the city and the suburbs. But they kept thinking about the old neighborhoods and some kept coming back. In the early 20th century, those Jews who left the Lower East Side were replaced by new arrivals until Congress severely limited immigration in 1924. Beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, what scholars call a white ethnic revival turned many Americans' attentions to their ancestries, and American Jews thought about their former ethnic neighborhoods with nostalgic longing. As they did so, American Jews reflected together on this history in a number of different ways. In the mid-1970s, they were inspired by the African-American roots movement of that era, which was named for Alex Haley's book, his 1976 book, Roots. It's an imaginative history of an African-American family. And inspired by Roots, American Jewish genealogists began to organize and educate themselves, writing manuals and creating Jewish genealogical societies in the 1970s. A decade later, in the 1980s, you might recognize that image, historians and preservationists started paying attention in earnest to the role that historic synagogues might play in Jewish public life. And the 1980s is really the beginning of the history of the revival and renovation, the early thoughts about the renovation of the Eldridge Street Synagogue. And in the 1990s, mainstream publishing houses started publishing an increasing number of children's books that depicted stories of Jewish immigration as part of the American story of multiculturalism. And then in the early 21st century, the Eastern European Jewish culinary revival begins in earnest with the appearance of new artisanal delis and other businesses created by Jewish food entrepreneurs. So American Jews could connect to this past and other Jewish histories through a variety of older types of Jewish media, such as passively watching a movie or a live performance of Fiddler on the Roof. I'm gonna stop that GIF because it actually gets very annoying very quickly, though I think it's funny. But I think that the new materials of nostalgia that I'm looking at encourage a more active longing for Eastern European Jewish immigration history. I think there's something different about going to the museum at Eldridge Street rather than watching a performance of Fiddler on the Roof. Longing activates agency beyond a passive connection. Jewish genealogists actively research their family histories. Parents read illustrated books aloud and encourage children to play with toys. Restaurant patrons literally consume their longing for Eastern European Jewish immigration history. And visitors at historic synagogues, of course, literally and metaphorically step into the footprints of past congregants. And if you've taken a tour at the museum at Eldridge Street, you know that the docents and the staff members work hard to bring you into the story. So some of these forms of pop culture are accessible for all ages, like the catchy tunes, the memorable dances, and iconic images of Fiddler on the Roof. and others are designed for children of certain ages and their parents. We don't normally think of the institutions that create and distribute children's books and dolls. We don't normally think of like publishing houses as public history. Public history are programs and institutions like museums that teach history to a broad public. But I think that actually nostalgic children's books help parents to prime children to understand a certain emotional reaction to certain Jewish histories as an American Jewish value. And in fact, when I spoke to Diane Hess, executive editor at Scholastic Press, the mainstream press that has published many Jewish children's books, Hess told me most kids don't have any Jewish background now. That's how she sees it. She said they don't have that nostalgia for the immigrant grandparents. And for me, it's like, you can't lose that because that's sort of the glue that's been holding the culture together. So children's books about Jewish history help place Jewish children and their parents within family stories and within broader community stories. And the fact that you're selling certain or distributing Jewish children's books kind of reconstitutes nostalgic longing. It helps pass it from one generation to the next. That's what Hess hopes that the Jewish books she's published are doing. We also don't normally think of restaurants as sites of public history, but they actually can significantly shape emotional reactions to certain pasts. The immediacy of eating encourages answering and asking questions about yourself, your identity, and your community. And Jewish restaurants, like Jewish museums, encourage patrons to share their family stories. Elise Lerner, the owner of On Rye, a since closed deli in Washington, D.C., told me a lot of people come in and they want to tell us their experiences they've had with this food growing up. So a lot of restaurateurs and purveyors of Jewish food share their own stories of their family histories and their community histories through their food, their decor, and the presentation. And like all sites of public history, these eateries have a very particular point of view. So for Karen Edelman, who's the co-owner of Saul's Deli up the road from me in Berkeley, California, she told me the principal story told in Saul's Deli is that of Ashkenazi Jews from the old world, and then New York, and then they continue going west until they reach California. And I love this story because it makes Saul's Deli and its patrons the center of Jewish history. And I love this as somebody who lives nearby in San Francisco. And I love that the work that this story is doing, the way she's presenting her food at her restaurant, places her patrons and their communities within stories that matter emotionally. But at the same time, even as at the same time that these places are presenting stories that matter emotionally, that doesn't mean they're not thinking and encouraging folks to think critically about the past and about the effect of the past on the present. They can challenge who we think of as an authority on Jewish history, identity, and practice. So the restaurateurs that I spoke to, for instance, are deliberately making American Jewish food fit for the 21st century. They're reimagining classic Eastern European and American Jewish dishes in light of concerns about sustainability, reliance on local goods, and the slow food movement, as well as their emotional qualities. When Karen Edelman and Peter Levitt bought Saul's Deli in Berkeley, California from its founding owners, a lot of the restaurant's ingredients were shipped from New York to Berkeley. And they were participating in the Bay Area's food movement, which I think has now gone national, now a national food movement. But they began to reshape their menu with local and seasonal ingredients. They saw themselves as honoring Ashkenazi American cuisine by elevating it. But they ran into a pickle problem. As you may or may not know, a half sour pickle is a pickle that is properly made from a fresh cucumber and eaten 6 to 20 days after pickling. They wanted to serve pickles made from local cucumbers, which are grown between June and November. But it turns out that deli customers actually expect a half sour pickle to be available all year round. And for a short time, customers had to endure having half sour pickles alongside their sandwiches at Saul's only in seasonally appropriate months, along with lessons in agriculture, geography, and Jewish culinary history. As you can imagine, this was a hard lesson for some customers to swallow, so to speak, pun intended. I think that folks who work at the museum in Eldridge Street and similar institutions will I imagine that you might this kind of story of a tension between the work that you're doing and the work that you want to do, and tensions between the kind of expectations that visitors have might be familiar to you. So I want to suggest actually that the purveyors of nostalgic American Jewish public history, this is an image you might recognize. I want to suggest that the folks who are telling stories and shaping stories about nostalgic American Jewish public history, folks who are deliberately working to create community around particular materials and sites of Jewish public history, should actually be considered a kind of Jewish communal leader or even a religious expert. I think that Jewish genealogists, museum staff members and docents, children's book authors and publishers, restaurateurs create and curate the materials that are designed to elicit particular emotional and religious reactions to particular Jewish pasts. And I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, please, in the Q&A, but I think these are generally folks who are not usually recognized as Jewish community leaders or experts, either in scholarship or in Jewish community conversations. And not all of these folks see themselves as Jewish leaders. In fact, I think at museums in particular, staff members often work to deliberately minimize their own impact. They want to emphasize their patrons' authority, visitors' authority on the subject to solicit their buy-in. And I think that stepping back and acknowledging the leadership of these content creators points to the importance of these new types of Jewish communal organization. Examining them as Jewish communal and religious leaders shows us that they're guiding American Jews at least as much as those whose Jewish community leadership has been recognized throughout much of the 20th century. Folks who have been recognized like rabbis and directors of Jewish federations, American Zionist organizations, and certain other Jewish nonprofits. And in fact, I think that looking at the practices of nostalgia might help us break down binaries between religious leaders and lay practitioners. I think it's really interesting that for genealogists, you can be either a professional or an amateur genealogist and do the same work. A professional genealogist is one who does the work of researching family history for someone else for pay. And an amateur genealogist who might have at least as much training, at least as much expertise, is an amateur genealogist is one who's doing it on their own family history. And I think this helps break down who counts as a professional and who counts as an authority. Authoritative genealogists are those who uphold community standards while they honor family histories by researching and memorializing them through physical and digital records. They tell family stories, some of them say Kaddish, the Jewish mourner's prayer, among other practices that create physical and emotional connections to Jewish family and community histories. But just because I think that the creators and curators of American Jewish nostalgia should be considered religious leaders doesn't mean that audiences listen to them uncritically, as some of you may know. And this is also a position with which other religious leaders are certainly familiar. As at all sites of public history, docents and staff members at historic synagogues provide rules of acceptable behavior to visitors, but as I observed, visitors routinely refuse to observe these guidelines. I think the visitors at the museum at Eldridge Street are exceptionally well behaved. But Jewish visitors do often approach Jewish historic spaces with a sense of entitlement, and that's one that staff members actually work to encourage even as they try to regulate visitors' behavior. So for instance, those are genealogists. One of the other museums I looked at is the Jewish Museum of Florida, which is housed in two adjacent synagogue buildings that were once owned by a single congregation in South Beach in Miami Beach. And at one point, they had an advertising slogan that said, whether your family came here 100 years ago or today, this museum is about you and for you. And I thought that was so interesting because it's not actually clear who you are being addressed here. Do you need to be Jewish or Floridian or American? And what happens when visitors' idea of the past differs from staff members' vision? I appreciate that the museum is intentionally leaving all these questions unasked or unanswered, and they allow visitors to formulate their own answers in that void. And as I researched historic synagogues, I also looked at, in addition to Eldridge and the Museum at Florida, I also looked at the Toro Synagogue in Rhode Island and the Vilna Shul in Boston. And I repeatedly observed visitors focused on the way that their own family history is related to the site, or even reliving their past experiences as visitors there, ignoring and sometimes contradicting docents' remarks. And the Jewish Museum of Florida's slogan insists that you, whoever you are, have a stake in the museum's mission, regardless of your personal history and your view of the past. So a shared image of community nostalgia helps smooth over the differences between visitors and heritage institutions' constructions of the past. Let's see. So this conflict between patrons and the creators especially comes to the fore at Jewish delis. Deli owners constantly told me that customers are continually comparing restaurants outside New York to their ideal of a New York deli, even if customers haven't been to an actual New York deli in years, and even if restaurateurs repeatedly insist that they do not want to emulate a New York deli. At Saul's Deli, Edelman and Levitt really carefully explained to customers, recreating the New York deli is not our charge. Food, authenticity, flavor, sustainability, and being true to the values of our culinary roots are our first priority. So like the other folks that I'd call Jewish culinary revivalists, folks who are reimagining Jewish food in the 21st century, Edelman and Levitt are attempting to shift their customers' ways of thinking about what counts as authentic Jewish food, from thinking about an ideal place to new stories about Jewish food, history, and memory. Let's see. Let's see. What else did I want to tell you? I want to leave time for questions and chat. One of the things that I have found is that I'm really focusing in this book and in this project, I was really focusing on the story of Eastern European immigrants at the turn of the century. And so they're the story of those immigrants in the United States and the story of the history of those immigrants in Eastern Europe. And this story really, this nostalgia for this particular history really centers Ashkenazi experiences, a certain kind of European Jewish experience. It marginalizes other Jewish stories by necessity. And I found that, this works on an individual level as well as an institutional level. American Jewish genealogists might find that they have diverse backgrounds, but a lot of them are drawn to family stories of Eastern European immigrants that fit the dominant narrative. The materials and practices of nostalgia have to exclude certain people and certain stories. It's a really mainstream story, and that's how norms work. Sometimes other people's stories are folded into it. The menu at Saul's Deli offers a number of dishes from Middle Eastern cuisine inspired by Sephardi and Mizrahi Jewish pasts. Serving Middle Eastern dishes allows Saul's to serve more vegan and vegetarian entrees, which is important for a restaurant in Berkeley, but it can be challenging for a Jewish deli. Broadening that story a little bit is a little side step that's inclusive of both more Jewish pasts and more customers, and it allows Saul's to continue to tell the story of Jewish cultures and Jewish food beyond the monolithic narrative of Ashkenazi American food, Karen Edelman told me. But at the same time, this very inclusion also folds in non-Ashkenazi Jewish narratives into the history of Ashkenazi nostalgia. So the side dish might be Mizrahi, might be Middle Eastern, but the larger platter and the deli itself remains focused on Central and Eastern European Jewish heritage. So there's a lot more we could talk about, but I want to move towards wrapping up by thinking about how nostalgic activities like touring the museum at Eldridge Street or buying a pastrami sandwich at a deli, how thinking about these things as religious practices help us respond to the claims of Jewish leaders and sociologists who have seen Jewish religion on the decline in the United States. Since the mid-20th century, American Jewish community leaders have worried really loudly that American Jews' religiosity is waning. Something they often describe as assimilation into mainstream American culture. And the image on the screen is Look magazine's famous 1964 cover story about the vanishing American Jew. Some American Jewish historians like to point out that Look magazine no longer exists, but American Jews, of course, still do. In recent decades, Jewish community leaders have worried about the effects of intermarriage in what has been termed a marriage crisis or a continuity crisis. A lot of the folks doing the worrying have really limited definitions of religion. So congregational rabbis tend to have a prescriptive definition of religion. They are focused, understandably, on synagogue attendance and on the performance of holiday and life cycle celebrations. Quantitative sociologists tend to have similar definitions, and they're usually looking for activities that they can measure totally reasonably. They're looking at synagogue attendance, keeping kosher, or sending children to Jewish religious schools, for example. The most recent national study of American Jews, Pew Research Center's Jewish Americans in 2020, which came out in May of 2021, comes out of this legacy. It divides Jews into the categories of Jews by religion and Jews of no religion. Jews by religion are those who say their current religion is Jewish. And according to Pew, 27% of Jewish adults do not identify their religion as Jewish, but they consider themselves Jewish ethnically, culturally, or by family background. But the fact is, I think that American Jews, like most other Americans, just aren't very good at naming religion in their lives, naming where they find meaning in their lives. I think that the division between Jews by religion and Jews of no religion and related worries about the decline of American Jewish religion are incorrectly identifying the ways that Jews think about and practice Judaism in the United States. When Jewish community leaders and sociologists are distinguishing between Jewish culture and Jewish religion, a lot of the ways that American Jews are creating meaning in their lives as individuals, as families and communities are flattened or even erased. And I think that a lot of fears about assimilation resist the idea that Judaism, like everything that humans do, has changed and will always change over time. Fears about assimilation rely on the idea of a static Judaism, an unchanging Judaism, and a static, unchanging American culture, and they see them as mutually exclusive rather than responsive to one another. I want to conclude by saying I'm really motivated by, and I hope this won't embarrass anyone too much, but I'm really motivated by thinking about the wedding of Courtney Byrne Mitchell and Maddie Ettenheim, now the Byrnheims, who met as staff members at the museum at Eldridge Street. I know some of you know them. And I'm incredibly grateful to both of them for talking to me at different points in my research. Courtney and Maddie married in 2018. They held their wedding at a dim sum restaurant down the block, and they held their ketubah signing, their signing of their wedding contract, and their wedding reception at the synagogue the next day. I know some of you were there. Theirs was an interfaith wedding of 2 women. And the wedding ceremony had been performed by Hannah Griff Slevin, the folklorist who did so much to shape what became the museum at Eldridge Street. And I think that their wedding, an interfaith wedding of 2 women, and the role that Eldridge Street played in their relationship and in their wedding shows us some of the possibilities of the ways that nostalgia can work as an inclusive and expansive form of American Jewish religion. While some Jewish community leaders have been limited by a narrow understanding of Jewish continuity, I think that this moment shows us that there are many forms and possibilities for meaningful American Jewish futures. Recognizing the dynamic practices, desires, pleasures, and play of American Jewish nostalgia as religious ones can point us to thinking about the wide variety of ways that Americans find really existential meaning in their lives beyond traditional denominational structures, in institutions and through practices that are generally considered secular, like visiting a museum. Redefining American Jewish religion helps us expand where we see Americans finding meaning and which institutions we recognize as most powerful in their lives. Americans are shaped by norms and values that are articulated not just by their synagogues, their churches, their mosques and temples, but also by restaurants, publishing companies, toy manufacturers, gift shops, philanthropic organizations, and historic sites, which teach them not only how to behave, but also how to feel. So thank you. I really welcome any conversation with you about this work. Thanks so much.
Rachel, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I encourage everyone to participate in the Q&A. Again, you can raise your hand or type into the chat box. You may also unmute yourself. But Rachel, I do have a question to start off. It's so interesting to learn more about your research, and it particularly resonates with me because my undergraduate thesis actually focused on Jewish and Chinese communities' desire for nostalgia through food establishments in New York, in Lower East Side, specifically looking at Katz's Deli, Namwa Tea Parlor. And in my research, I was looking at a lot of reviews at the time. I think restaurant reviews on Yelp, these types of things were just starting to become a big mainstay, I think, in the ways that people were looking for authority on opinions about certain establishments. And it was so interesting to read about people's perceived authenticity of certain establishments. And my question for you is about the representation of these 21st centuries, what you called constructions of the past. I mean, maybe not so much the past since they are legacy restaurants, right? So can you elaborate more on what your take is on maybe some of the criticisms some might argue would be like the kitschifying, if that's not a real word, but I'm making it into a word, of these establishments? You touched upon it a little bit, but I'd love to hear more.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things there. Certainly when I told people that I was working on nostalgia, they often thought about kitsch. And they often had really negative understandings of nostalgia. So, and a lot of the scholarship on nostalgia is actually really negative as well, which is why I was really hesitant to tell, when I was doing this research, I didn't want to tell people that I was necessarily working on nostalgia. I think that nostalgia is an emotional reaction to the past, longing for a past that can't be recovered. This is funny to me because none of the past can be recovered. That's how time works, right? And it necessarily flattens it necessarily flattens. It gives a flatter story, right? One that's more accessible. But I think nostalgia doesn't just reduce things, it also produces things. It helps place you in a community story, helps place you in a family story. It places you in a larger narrative. So I'm not worried by kitsch because I think it produces an emotional reaction as well. It helps place you in a story. It has negative aspects too, but I think it's a lot of this book is pushing back on those negative aspects so that we can get to a more productive conversation to think about what it does for people. A lot of that, I love hearing about your research on restaurants. It's totally fascinating. Actually, a lot of the restaurants that I was working on, I wasn't working on legacy delis at all, which might be more akin to the places that you were looking at. The folks that I was looking at were were places that were created largely in the 21st century, and really looking at those legacy institutions and saying, we can do something new and better, build on this legacy and turn it just a bit. We can be explicit about the ways in which we want to be attuned to sustainability and efforts to have local foods, right? And really the food sites, I think, were had a little bit more freedom to be explicit, I think, about their contemporary concerns. But I think some of the other sites that I looked at, if you're a historic synagogue, you've got a space to work in. And I think, there's tons of creativity that's been done at Eldridge Street and other places. I look at, some of the art exhibits that have been held at the museum at Eldridge Street. And I think that's really a place where staff members at Eldridge have been able to explore and push back, I think. Maybe I see folks pushing back against visitors' notion of what counts as an authentic history in really creative ways in that space. Well, does that begin to answer that question?
Yeah, please. That does. And it's it's really fascinating because I think even the term authenticity is so contested right now. Who is the authority on what is authentic? What does it mean to be authentic? Does that really matter? So really, really fascinating discussion.
Yeah. I'll just briefly speak to that. I think, I think that the spaces that I'm looking at help direct people in conversations about what counts as authenticity and allow a give and take with visitors or with patrons. And someone sent me an interesting, Ava Byrne sent me a direct message question that I appreciate. Folks can feel free to drop your questions in the public chat so we can all see them if you like. Ava really gets to the heart of it and says, why do you feel the need to equate Jewish nostalgia as religion rather than just value Jewish nostalgia as a valuable cultural history? Judaism is thousands of years old. Travel any place in the world, go into a synagogue, and it's our religion that we have in common, not our food, not our delis, not our museums. It's our Jewish religion that keeps Judaism alive, not a temporary nostalgia seen as some people seen by people who have no connection to Judaism, even if they in 100 years Sauls or Tabashniks or other food sites might not exist, but Judaism as a religion will continue. So I think this is a really, that's a valid perspective. I'm offering another one, and I'll just briefly explain why I see value in naming this as religion. And again, look, if this doesn't work for you, that's fine. What I'm doing in this work is I'm coming from a particular field of scholarship that is invested in thinking about what can be useful if we rethink the category of religion. If that doesn't appeal to you, that's fine. But I do think it can be really helpful for, number one, thinking about what makes religion, what actually is religion, and how we find meaning in our lives. For me, as a scholar, religion is fundamentally meaning making. And it can be a meaning making that happens based on liturgy and synagogue, keeping kosher, Jewish dietary laws, if that's your thing. Absolutely. I'm not anti-traditional religion by no means. But I do think it's really important to think about how folks who do practice religion in traditional ways and folks who don't do find meaning in their lives in ways that connect them that help them answer existential questions. To me, I think, that's what religion does. It helps answer existential questions. And I want to kind of gently push back on the idea that traditional Jewish religion doesn't change. It actually changes a whole bunch around the world and over time. It really, really does. The thing I tell my students, number one, first day of class, last day of class, is that studying history is the study of change over time, right? So whether we're studying the history of religion or the history of anything else, we are studying Jewish religion. Now, okay, so I think, we can look at prayer books, we can look at certainly food practices. Keeping kosher is going to change a whole lot more than you might think it does. So there's that. Everything traditional religion is going to be changing too. Now, sometimes folks say a version of your really wonderful question, and they say, all right, like this is a moment, like Jewish nostalgia as a meaningful practice. These historic sites are of a particular moment. The artisanal delis are of a particular moment. Sure. I think things change over time. What I'm saying in this research is that, this is how some American Jews have formed meaning in their lives from about the 1970s to, I think I see it continuing through the present day. And in fact, when I started this research in the early 2010s, my advisors were helping me think about this project. And, it was like, well, how long is this stuff going to last? Like, especially the artisanal delis, right? Hipster delis. How long is this stuff going to last? Is it really still going to be there when you're finishing your dissertation? Is it still going to be there when you're turning this into a book? Turns out it has the epilogue to my book is kind of where are they now? Right. And a shocking number of them are still around. So it turns out that nostalgia is still really, this particular kind of nostalgia is still really appealing to a lot of American Jews. What I'm not saying in this book is that it has to be appealing for everyone. I'm not saying that it's the only way to be Jewish. Absolutely not. I'm not doing prescriptive work. I'm not saying that folks should be doing this or have to be doing this. But as a scholar, I'm stepping back and saying, look, this is a way that some American Jews, actually a shockingly large number of American Jews, are making meaning in their lives. And what can we learn when we take that seriously? For me, taking it seriously involves using the word religion. But if that's not your thing, by all means, I am, you're absolutely entitled to your own analysis. So thank you for that question, Ava. I appreciate it.
We have another question, and again, people can write to one of us directly. They can write it into the chat. They can also raise their hand. But the question for you, Rachel, is, do you feel this kind of analysis is unique to ethno-religions?
That's a great question. It's a great question that takes up an entire class period when I tell my students. So I am not sure that ethno-religion is a super, I'd love to hear more actually if this person wants to chime in and elaborate a little more. I'd love to know a little bit more about where they're coming from. Hi,
Rachel, that was me.
Yeah. Thank you, Maya. Maya, do you want to chime in and tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking of?
Yeah, so I was just thinking of, at the end of your talk, we were discussing, the Toldo image that you showed and sort of the genealogical aspects of that period in time, and then sort of moving into, after that, the food and the different examples that you provided. And I think in the beginning as well, you gave the Native American example as well, which sort of, the way that Judaism is linked to Native American culture is that we are, as some people call it, I know it's a controversial term, but as some people call it, an ethno-religion. Obviously, not everyone in Judaism is, ethnically Jewish, but most are. And that's not the case for other religions, such as most sects of Christianity or even Islam, for that matter. So I just wonder if you were studying different religions in this sort of context of nostalgia, if you would do so differently as not an ethno-religion, if we want to call it that.
So I really, really appreciate the question, and I will answer it. I want to push back a little bit on the idea that that I think 100 years ago we would see a lot of Christians as what you call ethno-religions. We would really be thinking about Irish Catholics as different from Italian Catholics. We would be thinking about Ukrainian Christians as different from Lithuanian Christians, right? And Polish Christians. So I think actually we, until very, very recently, were thinking about, and certainly many, many types of Muslims are tied to where they come from, right? So I think actually it's not unique to Jews, and I think we might think about all kinds of people as both as having racial or ethnicity tied to religion. But do I think that this is unique? In some ways, it depends on what the this is. It's such a good question. Really appreciate it. I think nostalgia happens in everybody's practice. Or I think that people tell stories that long for the past. And certainly everybody, uses food to tell stories about their people and their history. Sometimes Jews like to imagine that they have a particular relationship with food. I want to push back on that a little bit, because actually, like, having a relationship with food is like a fundamental part of the human experience. So Jews might have, a particular one, but everybody has a relationship with food, as Sophie was indicating with her comment about her research. What is different about the materials that I am looking at, what I do see as unique, is I think that the nostalgia, the American Jewish nostalgia that I'm looking at, I think is being really institutionalized in a particular way in the 1970s to the present, that this is a particular story that we see all over the place. And it is told through institutions, right? It is told through genealogical societies, is told through museums. It is told through the really important institution of PJ Library. I think is the most important American Jewish institution. Nobody's writing about it. I am, but nobody else is. Through restaurants, right? That this emotional connection to the past has been institutionalized. And that I see as very American and very late 20th, very early 20th century. So that's the part that I see as unique, not something that I think will stick around forever, because I think things change over time, but that seems to me to be very American Jewish of a particular moment. I see a hand.
Thank you. We have a hand raised. You can please unmute yourself. iPad 2.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, go ahead.
My name is Jane, and for the past 30 years, my family has been a member of the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism in Westport, Connecticut, in Fairfield County, Connecticut. So your discussion, there's a lot of what you're talking about that's very familiar and part of our congregation. And yet we really see ourselves as another branch of Judaism, though we don't have a theistic approach. So I wondered if you were familiar with it and what you had to say about that.
This is so funny and so delightful, because this is the second conversation this week that I've had with humanistic Jews and my work. So that's really a delight. I will say, so on the one hand, what I'm looking at is something that I think cuts, like, really, what I think is really interesting is that it cuts across Jews of all and no denominations. And one thing that I really wish that these big national studies of Jews would do, they're starting to do it a little bit more, is ask, have you been to a Jewish museum in the last year, right? I think the last study, the Pew study, I think finally did, but like, it happens, and I'm not saying all Jews go to museums, right? Certainly folks on this call know that, but all kinds of Jews go to museums, right? All kinds so this is a norm that cuts across other religious divisions. But at the same time, it's really a special place in my heart when humanistic Jews, might see themselves in my book, because a lot of my research early on was influenced by a humanistic Jew, David Kleiman. I don't know if he was a member of your congregation. He was a New York Jew, who was a Jewish genealogist who really helped guide my research into Jewish genealogy. He also created the experience of the Visitor Center at the Torah Synagogue, and he was a major Jewish foodie. So he played a really important role in my entry into the world of the institutions of Jewish nostalgia. And he passed away in 2014 when I was still pretty early in my research, but I really, I try to honor his legacy in my research. So I'm really glad to hear that that you might see some connection to it. Thank you.
Yes, certainly do.
Thanks.
So we're actually just past the hour. So if there's anyone else who wants to make any final remarks or questions, Jane, thank you so much for raising your hand. It was really great to hear your voice and to get your participation and engagement. Okay. Well, Rachel, thank you again so much for your work and your research and for spending the evening with us and engaging with us in this conversation. I think definitely we all have a lot to think about now. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. It's still early where you are in San Francisco. And everyone else who is here, thank you very, very much. And I hope to see you in person at the museum sometime soon. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank
Bye.
you.